Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, once again. As we have already been introduced to the speakers of this session, we have with us Mr. Rudrangshu Mukherjee, the chief guest of today's session, and Ms. Ira Mukhoty, the author of the book. Let us put our hands together for our speakers, please. Thank you. May I now request the chief guest, Mr. Rudrangshu Mukherjee, to officially unveil the cover of the book. Ladies and gentlemen, I would also request Ms. Ira Mukhoty to kindly unwrap the book and officially launch the book, The Lion and the Lily by the Aleph Book Company. May we put your hands together, please?
Absolutely, yes. Good point.
Good morning. Ira, thank you for coming to Calcutta and welcome to Calcutta. It's a privilege to release this book and talk about it a little. I was just telling Ira that if the British hadn't come here, she and I would have actually have had the same surname because Mukherjee is an anglicization of Mukhoty, as Tagore is an anglicization of Thakur. So there are more connections than Awadh with you and me. It's sometimes said that it's best to start at the very beginning, so I'll start at the very beginning. Will you tell us, I'm sure everybody also wants to know, why do you call the book The Lion and the Lily? What's the story behind that?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Mukherjee, for being here and for taking on the launch of this book for me. And thank you to everyone for showing up on a Sunday morning like this. Yes, I think if it hadn't been for the British, we would also be out of jobs, you and I, because we write a lot about the consequences of the British Empire. So the Lion and the Lily, this question is asked to me most often. Especially by people in the audience, and I think it is because nobody actually reads my books. They just say the first thing that comes to mind, which is the title of the book. In this case, we thought long and hard about the title because I wanted to give an impression, an idea of what the book was about, and the book is a complicated book because it covers a very complicated time in our history, the 18th century basically, and the rise, which is a very cosmopolitan, multicultural time, very volatile. A lot of things happen, around that period. One of which I wanted to bring out, one thread of that narrative that I wanted to bring out was the role of the French, the influence of the French East India Company, and once that collapsed, the role of the French adventurers and players in our history. So it began as a very different book and ended in a very different place, but nonetheless, the influence of the French remains. So the lily refers to the French fleur de lis symbol, the lily flower symbol, which was the French symbol of the French kings prior to the revolution of 1789. So after that, of course, it became the familiar rosette, the blue, white, and red flag. But before that, the French kings had the symbol of the lily flower. And the French adventurers who were in India at that time, many of them fighting independently for Indian rulers like the Marathas, the Jats, the Rohillas, and the Nawabs of Awadh, they often flew their banners which had the fleur de lis, the lily flower symbol, on their banners as they marched into battle alongside the Mughals, alongside the Rohillas, or whoever they were fighting for. And I found that a very quirky thing, and I thought that was a nice symbol of the French side of things. And where the lion is concerned, I wanted to show the Indian side of it. And the lion is a symbol which is very potent in India. A number of rulers use the lion symbol. We know that the Mughals used it on their flags. A couchant lion with the sun behind it was the Mughal symbol. Tipu Sultan used the tiger in a very powerful way. And of course, in India, Sher means lion and tiger. And the Nawabs of Awadh, for them, the symbology of the lion was very powerful because Imam Hussain, the great Shia martyr, was called the Lion of God. So I thought this was a powerful symbol that I could use in juxtaposition with the French lily.
You know, your mention of the French leads me to my second observation. Awadh has at least two very distinct parts to its history. One is what came to be called the Kingdom of Awadh. That is the truncated part of Awadh after Wellesley's annexation of 18103, when the entire Doab tract and the Doab districts were taken away, and in fact the more fertile tracts of the Doab, of the original Suba of Awadh was taken away. And then there is the 12, Lucknow and the 12 other districts which come to form the Kingdom of Awadh. That's a separate part of its story. Now this is where the French part offers me an entry point. When the Wellesley's annexing, the taking away, truncating Awadh, one of the reasons that he's actually given is that there is a French threat to Awadh. And the elaboration of that is kind of threefold. One is there's the possibility of the Afghans rolling down from Delhi, from Kabul via Delhi into the North Indian heartland, the Gangetic Plains. The Marathas moving slowly upwards from Western India towards Delhi, and this is what Wellesley emphasizes very strongly, the Marathas have an alliance with General Perrault. That's the French threat. And Wellesley actually, to win over the Board of Control and the Court of Directors, emphasizes the Perrault element, which is of course highly exaggerated. Perrault was not any kind of threat at all. He was a maverick French presence in Awadh. So how strong do you think this French element is actually in the making of the history of Awadh? Does this persist in what became the Kingdom of Awadh from the time of Shujauddaulah, Asafaddaulah, which is your main point of emphasis?
Thank you for that question, Professor. So as the Professor noted, there are two sections really to the history of Awadh. And I deal with the first section, with how the Suba of Awadh became what it was in the 18th century under Saadat Khan, Shujauddaulah and Asafaddaulah essentially. After Asafaddaulah, it was virtually signed over to the British, but till Asafaddaulah, they made a very staunch resistance and managed to keep their country independent. Now, what was interesting, for me when I observed and I started looking at the influence of the French, as the professor has been noting, is that all through the 18th century, there were these huge global Anglo-French wars happening across the globe. Something that we have completely forgotten, because these global wars actually had direct and immediate consequences for us in India in many, many ways. Consequences that we tend to overlook because, of course, the British wrote our history. As winners of the eventual winners of this mammoth contest between the French and the English, they are the ones who get to write the histories, and so they are the ones who get to write what is important and what isn't. But right through the 18th century, very important wars like the 7 Years' War or even the American War for Independence of the late 1770s, this was really a crucial war because the French helped the Americans gain their independence from the British. And the British, really, this was a moment of great angst and anxiety for them, because at the beginning of the 18th century, we have to remember that it was France which was the huge, overwhelmingly huge, powerful, populous, wealthy country, part of this enormous continent of Europe. Britain was this tiny island, very underpopulated, very little resources, and they were in a very weak situation vis-a-vis France. So and somehow this attitude remained with them throughout the 18th century, even as Britain itself got more powerful. But they really viewed the French menace as something extremely important, very powerful, and something that they had to fight against. And British Protestantism, the way in which it came to be elaborated, came out as very particularly set against French Catholicism. So by the end of the 18th century, as the French menace grew with the French Revolution and then Napoleon, they really evolved an identity based around the austerity of the Protestant English character. And a lot of what we think of as typically English values came around at this time in reaction to excessive French Catholicism, Popism, and those sort of attitudes. And I think that looking at the correspondence of the British East India Company officials writing back home to their bosses in London, it seems very apparent that they used the threat of this French menace very knowingly and very systematically to in fact engage in far more territorial wars in India than was justified by events on the ground. Because after the mid-18th century or so, French ambition in India after the 7 Years' Wars really changed completely. They no longer had the territorial ambitions that the British did. And for them, from now on, the aim would be to block British interests wherever they found them by trying to bolster Indian powers who were powerful enough and ambitious enough to oppose the British. But they really lacked an overall cohesive sort of strategy to fight for themselves in India. But the British continued to use the notion of the French menace, this Catholic French presence, always gnawing at their borders, and they used it very provocatively and in a very cynical manner to justify their own territorial expansions. And we know that even from Tipu Sultan at exactly the same time. We know, looking at the sources today, that Tipu Sultan did not have the sort of ambitions that the British accused him of. They used the French presence as an excuse to attack Tipu Sultan and eventually assassinate him. And they used the same sort of motivations in Awadh as well. The French presence in Awadh was never the sort to threaten the British at all, but they used it, very cynically.
So you're absolutely right about this French obsession that the British had. I mean, if you look at the early history of Calcutta, when they built Fort William, all the guns, save two, pointed towards the river. That's because they expected a water attack, and the water attack could only come from Chandanagar, where the French presence. The only two guns pointed were what was known as the Eastern Avenue, now called Bawazar Street. And this is one of the reasons actually why Siraj so successfully in 1756 gets entry into Calcutta, because he doesn't come by the water. He doesn't come by river. He comes from what is best described as the rear side. He comes through the salt marshes, and therefore he can just walk into Calcutta in 1756 and sack it. But moving away from the French and the British and to look at the internal history of Awadh, I have two kinds of questions. One is, after the Battle of Buxar, which for reasons I won't go into just now but can be discussed later, is the most decisive battle in North India, much more decisive than Plassey. Awadh is opened up economically to the trade of the English East India Company, and more importantly, the trade of the private servants of the English East India Company. What kind of impact do you think that kind of trade and that kind of infiltration into the Awadh economy, what kind of impact did that have?
So I would like to answer that question by illustrating what happens on the ground around that time. So Professor Mukherjee is correct that it opens trade, though Shuja-ud-Dawla fights very hard to have those conditions overruled. He was very opposed to the British coming and being offered tax-free trade in his country, as was Asaf-ud-Dawla, which means that they really realized it for the menace that it was. They realized how destructive British presence in trade was. Eventually, privateers, certain private individuals are allowed to trade. Hastings allows some of his private friends to trade in Awadh because it's a very, very rich province and they make a lot of money. But what happens in the 1780s is an insurrection that we often don't talk about. It is an insurrection that kind of takes over the whole of the Awadh countryside when it begins with, with Raja Chait Singh being captured by Hastings. Now Hastings, when he hears that war has started in America and France is involved in this war, Britain and France are basically fighting over America, he writes to his superiors and says, because Britain is losing a lot of money in the war, I will get the excess money from Raja Chait Singh. I will get it from Benares. He has actually written a letter to this effect. So he goes to Raja Chait Singh and asks him for an extra subsidy to sort of, knowing that it will help the war effort that Britain is undertaking in America. Raja Chait Singh Raja Chait Singh of Benares refuses this because he's already paying a yearly subsidy. He doesn't see why he should pay any more money. Eventually, Raja Chait Singh is imprisoned by Hastings. Raja Chait Singh runs away from Benares, helped by his soldiers, and the entire countryside is in an uproar against this terrible treatment of their Raja. And helping the Raja Chait Singh are the Begums of Awadh. Nawab Begum and Bahu Begum are friends of Raja Chait Singh, and they incite all their people, all their soldiers, people in the countryside, they send their eunuchs, the Khwaja Saras of Awadh, they send them with orders to tell everybody who can afford to send soldiers, who can become a soldier themselves, to join in this sort of insurrection, in this rebellion, because they need to fight the British. And the reason this insurrection sort of spreads like wildfire and becomes incredibly powerful, something that we seem to have forgotten completely today, is because the British, when they trade in Awadh, do so in a very violent and extractive manner. So they send armed forces into the countryside, and if people are not paying their tax revenues, they are shot or hung from trees, and they use excessively violent and cruel methods to extract all of these resources. Which is why when the order comes to help Raja Chait Singh and to fight against the British, there is so much of popular resistance to this, and so the Nawab and the Begums of Awadh are able to raise so many forces so that the British at this time have to sort of garrison themselves in Lucknow. Claude Martin has to offer his his palace as a refuge for other English people. People are locked up, barricaded in their homes, the English, and they're afraid to step out into the city because it has become so dangerous for any English person to be seen anywhere in the cities or in the countryside.
Ira, just if I could interrupt your narrative. I mean, that insurrection is so strong and the British take such a beating that there was a verse coined at that time, ridiculing what the British were doing. And they deliberately inverted it by saying that, Ghoda par hauda, hati par jin, jor se bhaga Warren Hastings. So, they really had to flee, and they didn't even have the time to put the proper ornamentation on the proper animals. So it's a very important
I think Hastings had to run away to Chunar, and he had to hide there for some time.
For some time. And, and then of course, the way he treated the Begums of Awadh becomes a major element in the impeachment proceedings against him in the House of Commons. So we are running a little short of time, so two more questions really on the internal history of Awadh. One is, how do these events, particularly one of them, the grant of the Diwani, affect the evolution or the emergence of painting and portraiture? Because sitting in Calcutta, I can't avoid this question because there is a huge painting in the Victoria Memorial of Shuja-ud-Dawla handing over the Diwani to Clive. Have you looked into this? How did this evolve, this kind of style of painting, very realistic?
Yes. So the evolution of paintings is something that I talk about a fair deal. In fact, I was talking about this with my friend in the audience here, Rana. I really want to talk about the way in which history is written and the narrative that we choose to tell each other. history is really not just about the battles and dates and conquering territory. That is what the men do. And that is what is talked about, what is remembered. But women are involved in so many different ways that we sort of ignore. So I have talked about the role of the Begums as well in this book to sort of emphasize that point. But another area that I'm interested in is how culture comes about. What are the influences that shape culture that is created? And paintings, the paintings of Awadh are something that have only in recent decades been reanalyzed and given the place of importance that they really deserve, because we were often told that the late 18th century was a time of sort of creative decrepitude, and the great Mughal art of the earlier period of the 17th century, of Shah Jahan's time, for example, they are no longer as vibrant as they once were, and artists are no longer painting with the strength and creativity that they did before. But actually, painting evolves, painting styles evolved enormously under the sort of pressure of the different, the different elements that are exercising all sorts of pressures on the culture of the country. So as Professor Mukherjee was saying, there is the influx of realistic oil paintings, for example. There are also oil paintings also. Tilly Kettle, the first European artist who painted in oils, came to Awadh at this time, and he painted some very startling portraits of Shujauddaulah and Asaf-ud-Daulah, and that really influenced the way in which local Mughal-trained artists would create images of the rulers in turn. So they took certain aspects of that realism. Of course, we know that they had seen realistic portraits from the time of Akbar itself, and they chose to use it at that time as well. But now there's a great deal more influence of the Europeans. There is an influence also in cartography, the way in which maps are drawn. Jean-Baptiste Gentil, one of the Frenchmen, produces a very extraordinary document called the Atlas, in which he uses Abu al-Fazl's documents to create a brand new sort of cartographical document showing the maps of India. So Indian art, Mughal-trained artists definitely react in very vibrant and unusual ways to the pressures of what they see as European art, but they don't just blindly copy these techniques. Instead, they subvert things like perspective, like three-dimensional paintings, shadows, and they use these new techniques to portray certain coded symbolisms that are only apparent to the local rulers because they understand the way in which to decode these paintings. So we get a very complex sort of situation that comes about in the painting world, and it is now being reassessed by art historians, and we recognize it for what it is.
So the emergence of cartography is important because around the same time, Renal is also drawing up the map of Bengal, which is one of the earliest maps on western lines that we have of the Suba of Bengal. But I'll end with a completely different note. From around the late 1760s right up to the final annexation of Awadh in 1856, there is a running trend of part legend and part history of the generosity of the Awadh Nawabs to everybody, not just the people they patronized, but even for common people. I mean, jisko deta na mola, usko deta Asaf-ud-Daulah. That's shopkeepers, old shopkeepers of Lucknow still say that when they open the shutters in the morning or in Hazratganj or elsewhere. So, how does this start? And it's remarkable that when Wajid Ali Shah, I'm now jumping well beyond your chronological framework, when Wajid Ali Shah is exiled to Calcutta and he walks actually from Lucknow to Kanpur to take the steamer to Allahabad, there are thousands of people say 10,000 people walking behind him, singing his songs, and weeping and singing his songs. And Jab Chhod Chale Lucknow Nagari, of course, being the most common. But what I want to ask based on these kinds of things is, do you think there is a different notion of kingship that is emerging in the different notion of power that the Nawabs and later the kings, And I think Satyajit Ray captures this very well in Satranj Ke Khiladi. Then in one sentence when he makes Wajid say it, we don't know whether Wajid said it or not, ask Ali Naki Khan, he said, go and ask the residents, do any of Victoria Begum, Victoria's subjects sing her songs? You know, I think that's a
God
signal.
forbid they sang a song.
You know, that's a signal, I think, of a different notion of power and kingship that is emerging. Would you have any observations
Yes,
on that?
thank you. That's really an excellent point. And I think a contemporary historian of that time, Saeed Hussain Khan, I think he wrote to say that how do you expect the British? They don't ever build a caravanserai. They don't build a garden. They don't build a hospital. They don't build a bridge. If they repair a bridge, they will charge you tax for it. And they said, how do you expect anything different? They are occasional sojourners. So that was the attitude of the British. They were here for a short time. They were here to extract money, take it back home. They were not here to lay down roots and to create anything. So obviously they would not be spending money in the country. The total opposite example can be seen in the Nawabs of Awadh, who were very much, of course, in the country. And I think the best, this example of this tendency of excessive generosity, I think starts with Asaf-ud-Daula. He, of course, Shuja-ud-Daula was very busy, you know, after the Battle of Buxar, just stabilizing his country. But Asaf-ud-Daula, who comes to a relatively stable country in Awadh, he inherits this enormous treasure as well, this enormously rich province. He really spends a lot of money and is extremely generous in everything that he does. I think partly some of that may lie with the fact that there is not, the things that he can spend his money on start becoming limited by the British at this point, just as later they would do in a much more catastrophic manner with Wajid Ali Shah. He can't spend money, for example, on his army in the way that he would like to, in the training of his army, on buying, you know, soldiers, paying for them. So one of the ways, obviously, in which he starts spending more and more money is the convenience of travelers and for their huge generosity. So one of them would be given nazars or tokens, and he was, you know, he would just touch them with his hand and leave them on the ground for his retainers to pick up. So imagine how happy his retainers must have been. So, you know, the entire nobility, high society of Awadh became known for this extreme elegance of their gesture and their generosity.
You know, just one last and perhaps a provocative point is, at a time in which we are located where ideas of who is an outsider is being so hotly contested and debated, and sometimes even acted upon, this whole history of a Persian Shia immigrant coming to
and his brother Abbas was like Lakshman, and you know, they saw parallels to their own stories in the Shia stories, because the patrons, the Nawabs, were patronizing this in such a way as to bring in all the sort of different members of their society implicated in this great culture, made them part of it, and made them feel that this was their culture. This was one great shared, you know, Ganga Jamni culture that we today talk about.
When the rebels of 1857 put Birjis Qadar on the throne, technically he is the last king of Awadh. When they put Birjis Qadar on the throne, he was only 10 or 11 years old. They danced around the throne after putting him on the throne. And when they danced around him, what they said was, "You are our Kanhaiya. You are our Krishna." So a group of mostly Hindu Sipahis are dancing around a Muslim monarch saying, "You are our Kanhaiya." Of course, they're invoking the fact that Birjis Qadar's father in one of his operas danced as Krishna. So as you say, I mean, this is a completely different cultural world which is on the point of disappearing, unfortunately. So I'll stop there. Time up, it says, but maybe we could have a couple of questions, short, pointed questions, but only two, unfortunately. If any hands go up, then we can send the mics out.
So my question is to Rudrangshu, sir. So in your one of the book which you have written on Jhansi Rani Lakshmibai and Hazrat Mahal. Do you think there's uprising of both of this woman warrior ladies in Jhansi and in Awadh? Was it really came out of any patriotic feeling, or it was just at the last point where their narrow personal interest was totally challenged by British East India Company? Why I am asking this question, in one of your Bengali article also published in 1988 Ananda Bazar Patrika, you very clearly gave an indication that this particular uprising with Lakshmi Bai and Hazrat Mahal were not really out of the patriotic feeling. There was a personal interest involved in this. What is your take on this?
Well, in that article, I did not talk about Hazrat Mahal firstly. So factual correction. Secondly, it all depends on what you mean by patriotic. I mean, they were not thinking at least all of India. Rani of Jhansi was thinking of Jhansi, her own principality. Mere Jhansi nahi dungi. That's what she said. She was thinking of Jhansi. Just right. Hazrat Mahal was thinking of Awadh. So I think the word patriotism is rather misplaced here in its modern connotations. They were trying to prevent the taking over of the principalities of which they saw themselves as to be the legitimate rulers being taken away from their dynasties. That's what they were fighting about. If you call that self-interest, well, it's self-interest.
So my question is for Ira, and it's a touch on the provocative side since it's addressed to a historian. But we live in an age where we have access to information on our fingertips, your Twitter, whatever, and yet all we have is misinformation. And we are talking about events that happened many, many eons ago. So how much of it is actual history? How much of it is set in stone? And how much of it is just the stories which have trickled down?
Do you mean the Twitter stories?
No, I mean, I'm talking about history itself. The facts, is history really set in stone, or is it merely the stories which have trickled down?
Yes, that's a really interesting question, you know, which brings us to the crux of the matter of what is history. And I think even more important is who tells the stories, because really history is about the stories. It's the stories you choose to take from the historical matter lying around, you know. So there is evidence, of course, there are manuscripts, written resources, there's, you know, sculpture, painting, there's architecture. But a lot of it depends on which stories you tend to highlight, you know. It is, history often happens in a very complicated way. There are many multiple narratives. So for example, when I know that when I set out to write a history, whether it is this one or even, you know, the story of Akbar, the history of Akbar, I know that I am going to prioritize wherever I can the voices of women, because they are part of history, but they have been written out of history. So which is true or which is untrue is very difficult to say. So for example, Bahu Begum, you know, in my book, she tells Hastings that after the Battle of Buxar, Shuja-ud-Dawla has to pay a huge stipend to get back his country. And it is Bahu Begum who gives Shuja-ud-Dawla her money, her, you know, whatever she has from her treasury, from her dowry, and she gives it to Shuja-ud-Dawla, and he is able to buy back, therefore, his country. And she later on tells Hastings, she tells the English, whatever Shuja-ud-Dawla had, this country, was thanks to me. So it is mine. I am legitimately correct in saying I have the right to rule this place. Whereas, you know, patriarchy would say that as a wife, as a Muslim woman, she should hand over power to her son. But whose point of view will you say? She is correct in her point of view as well. So history, I think in the end, more than right or wrong, is really about who is writing the stories, who is choosing to take certain certain elements from what we have lying around us to tell those stories.
And one last additional point, nothing in history is ever cast in stone.
I think the time up has been there for quite some time.
Thank
you for your indulgence. Thank you,
Ira.
Calcutta.
Thank you, Ira. And
Professor.
come back to Calcutta soon.
Thank you, I will.